Why is it that the moment you put down the drink, start waking up early, finish the degree, the people who once sat beside you at the same table suddenly go cold? Why does genuine progress so often feel less like a victory and more like a quiet betrayal of everyone who stayed behind? You felt it, that specific chill in a room that was warm 5 minutes ago. The jokes with just a little too much edge. The "who do you think you are?" hiding inside a compliment. Friedrich Nietzsche spent decades trying to name exactly this experience, not because he was bitter, but because he understood something most people never fully articulate. The punishment directed at those who surpass the norm is not random, and it is not personal. It is a mechanism. One of the oldest and most deeply wired mechanisms in human social life. In this video, we're going to examine that mechanism together. 6 specific reasons why the groups we belong to turn against the people who dare to outgrow them. Some of these will feel immediately familiar. A couple will be uncomfortable to sit with. And the final one is the most unsettling of all. Not because it describes what others do to you, but because of what it reveals about the nature of transformation itself. We won't get there until the end, and I'd ask you to stay, because that last piece changes how every other piece lands. Before we begin, if this kind of deep, honest examination of human nature is what you're here for, subscribing takes 1 second and make sure you don't miss what's coming next. Now, let's start with something far older than jealousy or ego. Let's start with the reason your ancestors would have recognized before they even had words for it. Think about where this reflex actually comes from. Envy comes later. Insecurity is a symptom, not a source. The impulse to push back against the person who rises above the shared norm is older than any of that. Much older. Evolutionary psychologists have traced what you might call the outlier punishment reflex back to the conditions of early human survival. Groups that stayed cohesive stayed alive. And cohesion required a kind of enforced sameness, a gravitational pull toward the center. Any member who deviated too far from what the group recognized as normal created friction. Not because they were wrong, necessarily, but because difference itself felt like risk. The group's response was almost automatic. Correct them, shame them, pull them back. Or, if none of that worked, push them out. Here is the part Nietzsche understood before the scientists caught up. That reflex never went away. It just put on different clothes. It learned to speak in the language of concern, of realism, of just being honest with you. The mechanism beneath those words is ancient. The words themselves are modern. And this matters. It matters enormously, because it means the people who resist your growth are not always doing it out of malice. Many of them are running a program so old it doesn't have a conscious author. They feel the discomfort of your movement away from the group center, and they act on it. Automatically. The way a hand pulls back from heat before the mind has even registered the word hot. Nietzsche called the herd's morality its most powerful weapon, not because it was violent, but because it felt like virtue. So before we get to the specific forms this pressure takes in your actual life, hold on to that frame. What comes at you when you grow is sometimes something far more instinctive and far harder to argue with. A reflex doesn't need a reason. It just needs a trigger. So now we know where the reflex comes from. Ancient. Instinctive, not personal, even when it feels devastatingly personal. But knowing the root doesn't tell you how it actually shows up in your life. That's what the next several minutes are about. The first mechanism is the one that hits closest to home because it doesn't come from enemies. It comes from people who started exactly where you did. Imagine 2 people, call them Ryan and Tom. Same neighborhood, same kinds of jobs they felt stuck in, same habit of talking about what they'd do someday. For years, the friendship runs on shared frustration. That's the glue. The mutual understanding that life is difficult and the circumstances aren't fair. Then Ryan quietly starts to change. He's not announcing anything. He just starts showing up differently, waking up earlier, putting money aside, taking the night class he'd been postponing for 3 years. 18 months later, the results are visible. And here is the moment that matters. Tom is not just watching a friend make progress. He is watching his own story fall apart. Because if Ryan, same background, same starting point, same obstacles, if Ryan could do it, then Tom's reasons weren't really reasons at all. They were choices. Choices Tom made, quietly, every single day, dressed up as circumstances. That realization is almost unbearable. And rather than bear it, most people do what the psyche does best under pressure. They redirect. Suddenly Ryan is showing off. He's changed. He thinks he's better than everyone. The criticism isn't about Ryan. It's about what Ryan's progress costs Tom, the comfortable story he'd been living inside. Nietzsche described this with a kind of cold precision. The person who reminds others that they could have chosen differently will never be forgiven for it. This is the first form the pressure takes, and it's painful precisely because you didn't do anything wrong. Your progress was the provocation. A lit candle doesn't attack the darkness, but the darkness notices. What Ryan experienced with Tom was personal. One friendship, one fractured story. But the second mechanism operates at a different scale entirely. It isn't about one person's discomfort. It's about what happens when an entire group shares the same ceiling, and someone from inside that group quietly walks through it. Every close-knit circle, a friend group, a family, a workplace team, tends to develop an unspoken agreement about what is possible. Not in words. Nobody sits down and says, "We've decided this is the limit." It happens through repeated conversation, through shared complaints, through the slow accumulation of, "That's just how it is," and "People like us don't really do that." Over time, this shared ceiling becomes almost sacred. It holds the group together. It is, in its own way, a kind of comfort. The comfort of knowing everyone around you has accepted the same constraints. Then someone inside that circle starts to dismantle the collective excuse architecture from within, just by living differently. And the group doesn't respond with curiosity. It responds with pressure. The comments start, subtle at first. "You've changed. You think you're too good for this now? I'm just saying, don't forget where you came from." What sounds like concern is actually the group's immune system activating. The person rising above the shared norm has become, without intending to, a norm-surpassing threat to the group's entire identity. Nietzsche had a term for the values a group uses to enforce this kind of leveling. He called it herd morality. And he was clear-eyed about how it works. What the herd calls staying grounded is often just a demand that you stay small enough to be comfortable for everyone else. The most suffocating walls are the ones built out of other people's definitions of what's realistic. But here is where it gets more complicated, because not all the pressure you face will come from the group. Some of it, the hardest kind to recognize, arrives wearing the face of someone who genuinely cares about you. This third form of pressure is the most socially sophisticated, and because of that, the hardest to defend against. It arrives as a conversation over coffee. It arrives in a quiet voice that says, "I just don't want to see you get hurt." Think about what that sounds like in practice. You tell someone close to you about a change you're making, a direction you're finally moving in after years of hesitation. And instead of curiosity, you get caution. Are you sure the timing is right? I've seen people try something like that before. It rarely works out. I'm only saying this because I care about you. The words are warm. The effect is a slow, cold weight pressing down on your chest. Nietzsche wrote about this mechanism with particular sharpness. He observed that the most effective way to keep someone in place is not to attack them. It is to reframe their ambition as naivety, their courage as recklessness, their desire to change as something requiring protection from itself. The critic wraps themselves in the language of wisdom and concern, and suddenly you're the one who seems unreasonable for pushing back. Here is the difficult truth. The person doing this often genuinely believes they are helping. They have translated their own discomfort at your movement, their own unexamined fear that you might actually succeed, into a moral position. Your growth becomes the problem. Their resistance becomes the virtue. Ask yourself this honestly. When someone in your life consistently uses the vocabulary of care to talk you out of becoming more, whose peace of mind is actually being protected? Yours or theirs? Nietzsche was precise about this too. When someone cannot tolerate your becoming, they will dress that intolerance in the most respectable clothes they own. The lock that looks like a hand extended to help you is still a lock. And we haven't even reached the fourth form yet, the one that doesn't hide behind concern at all, but behind something that feels, to the critic, like genuine authority. That fourth form, the one that hides behind authority rather than affection, is in some ways the most revealing, because it shows you something important about what criticism, at its core, is often actually doing. Watch how it works. Someone in your circle begins pointing out your errors with unusual enthusiasm. They notice every miscalculation, every stumble, every gap between where you are and where you want to be. They deliver these observations with the calm confidence of someone who sees clearly what others cannot. For a moment, they are the expert, the one with perspective, the one who knows better. Nietzsche analyzed this pattern in his writing on what drives human behavior beneath the surface. He recognized that people carry a deep need to feel significant, to matter, to have weight in the eyes of others. For those who have stopped pursuing their own growth, that need doesn't disappear, it redirects. And one of the most efficient redirections available is to become the authority on someone else's shortcomings. This is why the criticism is so often disproportionate. It isn't calibrated to the actual size of your mistake. It's calibrated to the size of the critic's need to feel elevated. When they find a flaw in you, they rise, not by climbing, but by pulling the floor down. The elevation is real to them. It just isn't built on anything solid. Nietzsche was unsparing about this. Genuine confidence does not need a diminished audience. It stands in an empty room and still knows its own value. The person who catalogs your every stumble with such precision is doing something quieter and sadder than that. They are borrowing your effort as a backdrop against which they can feel, briefly, like they are ahead. A judge who has never entered the arena is still just a spectator with a louder voice. Now, we've covered 4 of these mechanisms, and the next 2 are where this goes somewhere most people are not prepared for. The 5th mechanism is quieter than the others, slower moving, and in many ways, the one that cuts deepest, because it doesn't come from people who barely know you. It comes from people who once shared your exact life. There's a particular kind of social punishment that activates not when you change your job or your habits, but when you change on the inside. When your values quietly shift. When you stop finding the same things funny. When you lose your appetite for complaints you once shared eagerly. This internal transformation is the growth that draws the most hostility, and the reason is simple, even if it's hard to hear. External achievements can be explained away. A promotion can be attributed to luck or timing. A new skill can be dismissed as circumstantial. But when someone in your circle begins to carry themselves differently, when the old bitterness just isn't there anymore, when they no longer need the group's shared resentments to feel like they belong, that cannot be explained away. It is visible. And it is, to everyone still standing in the same place, deeply unsettling. Nietzsche called this the loneliness of self-overcoming. The people left behind don't just miss you, they feel judged by you, even if you have said absolutely nothing. Your changed life is the statement. The growth-hostility paradox reaches its sharpest point right here. The transformation that has cost you the most, the inner one, the one nobody directly sees, is precisely what generates the most pressure to undo. Old friends go stiff. Family dinners develop a new kind of tension. People who once felt close begin looking for evidence that you've become arrogant, that you've abandoned your roots, that you think you're better than where you came from. You haven't said any of those things, but your choices have. And choices, Nietzsche understood, are the loudest speech there is. The river doesn't judge the bank it has outgrown, but the bank always notices when the water stops running through it. Now we've reached the edge of everything we've covered, and what comes next is the piece I told you about at the very start, what I've been holding back. It's time. Here it is. The 6th mechanism. The one I've been holding back since the first minute of this video. And I want to say something before I name it. Everything we've covered so far, the fractured friendships, the group's immune response, the concern that isn't really concern, the authority borrowed from your stumbles, the hostility that follows interchange, all of it has been describing what happens around you. This last one describes what happens inside the people watching you. And that distinction matters enormously. Here is the truth that Nietzsche articulated with almost uncomfortable clarity. The most aggressive resistance to your growth is not driven by people who think you will fail. It is driven by people who are terrified that you won't. Think about what that actually means. Your failure would be comfortable. It would confirm the shared understanding that this kind of change isn't really possible, that the risks aren't worth it, that staying put was the sensible choice. Your failure lets everyone breathe, but your success, your visible, undeniable, continuing success, permanently closes a door. It takes away the story that circumstances were the deciding factor. It makes every day of standing still a conscious choice rather than an innocent circumstance. This is the deepest layer of the social psychology of why human groups punish those who dare to surpass the norm. It is not that your progress threatens them practically. It is that your progress answers a question they have been carefully avoiding asking themselves. And once a question has been answered out loud, you cannot pretend you never heard it. Nietzsche wrote that the person rising visibly is not hated for their arrogance, they are hated for their evidence. Evidence that the door was never locked, that it was always open, that the only thing keeping most people on one side of it was the quiet, collective agreement not to try. You didn't create that agreement, but your growth breaks it. The spark doesn't choose which room it illuminates, but every shadow in that room knows it has been seen. So where does all of this leave you, practically speaking? Because understanding these 6 mechanisms is one thing. Sitting with the weight of them, the ancient reflex, the collapsed stories, the group's shared ceiling, the concern that protects the wrong person, the borrowed authority, the terror of your success, that is another. And Nietzsche didn't stop at diagnosis. He had something to say about what you do with this understanding once you have it. The first thing he would insist on: not all resistance directed at you deserves to be dismissed. Some criticism is genuinely useful. Some of it points at a real flaw, a genuine blind spot, something worth examining. The question is, how to tell the difference? And the answer is actually simpler than most people expect. Useful criticism addresses what you did. It is specific, it can be tested, it leads somewhere actionable. What we've been describing tonight is different. It targets who you are becoming. It attacks the direction, not the step. It wants you to stop, not to improve. When someone consistently tries to talk you out of your growth, rather than help you grow better, that is the outlier punishment reflex, wearing whatever costume is available that day. Nietzsche was direct about what happens to those who surrender to it. He wrote that those who let the crowd's judgment replace their own judgment eventually stop being anyone at all. Quietly, one small retreat at a time, until the person they might have become is just a vague shape they can no longer quite see. The resistance you encounter is not a sign that you're moving in the wrong direction. Often, not always, but often, it is the most honest signal you have that you are moving in a direction that matters. Pressure is not proof of error. Sometimes it is just proof of altitude. And that brings us to the only question worth asking at the end of all of this. One question. I want you to sit with it honestly before the last part of this video begins. Here is the question I asked you to hold. When you think about the resistance you faced for changing, for growing, for refusing to stay exactly who you were, does it feel, looking back, like those people saw something genuinely broken in you that needed fixing? Or does it feel like they saw something forming in you that frightened them? Sit with that honestly, because your answer tells you something important, not just about the people who pushed back, but about what you chose to do when they did. Nietzsche spent the better part of his life being dismissed, misread, and shut out by the academic and cultural circles of his time. He understood the phenomenon we've been tracing together not as a spectator, but as someone who lived inside it. And what he concluded was not that the world was full of malicious people determined to hold others down. His conclusion was quieter and, I think, more true. Most people who resist another person's growth are simply frightened of the cost their own growth would require. It is easier to manage that fear by managing you, which means the pressure you feel when you change is a measurement. It measures how far you've moved from where the group expected you to stay. That gap between who you were and who you are becoming is not a wound to be apologized for. It is the only honest record of the work you've actually done. There's an image I keep returning to. Someone has just walked out of a room where the air was stale and the windows hadn't been opened in years. They're standing outside now. They can feel the difference in their lungs. And somewhere behind them, the room is still the same temperature it always was. The room hasn't changed, but the person who left it has. And that, in the end, is enough. If this conversation stayed with you, leave a comment with your honest answer to that question. And if you want more of this kind of thinking, subscribe. There's more coming.